Judge Grayson thought he was sentencing a clueless teen until the defendant started dismantling the case like a seasoned lawyer. Inside the Los Angeles County Courthouse, the air felt thick, almost suffocating. Spectators filled the gallery, murmuring as they watched the scene unfold. The defendant's table seemed too big for the young man standing beside it, hands in his pockets, chin lifted just enough to show he wasn't afraid. Jalen Dawson, 19, accused of grand theft auto and resisting arrest. The charges were serious, but the way Judge Walter Grayson looked at him made it clear the real trial had nothing to do with the law. Grayson leaned back in his chair, fingers drumming lazily on the polished wood. He peered down at Jalen over the rim of his glasses, lips twisting into something between a smirk and a sneer. "You think you're some kind of legal expert?" His voice carried dry amusement. "This isn't a debate club, kid." A few chuckles rippled through the courtroom. The bailiff, the stenographer, even the prosecutor. They were all in on the joke. Jalen wasn't laughing. He had spent years preparing for this moment. Not this exact one. He never planned on standing here as a defendant, but he knew the courtroom like the back of his hand. While other kids memorized basketball stats, he memorized case law. While his friends played video games, he played mock trials in his head. His mother, Denise Dawson, had worked as a paralegal for over 20 years. Jalen grew up listening to the stories she brought home: how prosecutors cut corners, how judges played favorites, how some defense attorneys barely tried. He absorbed everything. By 14, he could break down a trial better than most law students. But none of that mattered to Grayson. To him, Jalen was just another kid in trouble. "Let's make this quick." The judge sighed, flipping open the case file. "I have a golf game at 2. The audience chuckled again. But this time, something shifted. Jalen's lips curled into a faint, almost imperceptible smirk. Grayson had just made his first mistake. The prosecutor, Mitchell Carrington, rose with the air of a man who had already won. His suit was crisp, his tie perfectly knotted, and his voice carried the rehearsed confidence of someone who had delivered the same speech 100 times before. "Your Honor, the state will prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that the defendant, Jalen Dawson, was caught red-handed in a stolen vehicle. A 2022 Audi A6 reported missing just hours before his arrest. Officers pursued him through downtown, where he allegedly attempted to flee before being apprehended. His fingerprints were found on the steering wheel. The evidence speaks for itself." The crowd shifted, whispering. On the surface, it sounded damning. A stolen car. A chase. Running. Judge Grayson glanced at Jalen, then back at Carrington. "Go on." Carrington walked toward the jury, his polished shoes clicking against the floor. "The defense may try to convince you this was all a misunderstanding, that Mr. Dawson is some unfortunate victim of circumstance." He turned, locking eyes with Jalen for the first time. "But let's be honest. What kind of victim runs from the police?" The tension thickened. Jalen didn't blink. Carrington continued, flipping through his stack of papers. "Your Honor, I have here the testimony of Officer Daniel Ruiz, who personally witnessed the defendant behind the wheel before he attempted to flee. The car was confirmed stolen. The arrest was by the book." Grayson exhaled, nodding. "Sounds straightforward to me. And for most people in the room, it probably did." The case was clear-cut. A stolen car. A chase. An arrest. But Jalen had spent too many years studying trials not to see the cracks. Still, he stayed silent. Watching. Waiting. Grayson tapped his gavel lightly. "All right. Let's hear the defense's response." He turned to Jalen's lawyer, Lisa Thornton, a public defender who had barely said 3 words since stepping into the courtroom. She stood up, shifting nervously. "Your Honor, my client." Jalen placed a hand on her arm. A silent request. She hesitated, then sat back down. For the first time, Jalen spoke. "I'll be representing myself, Your Honor." The room went silent. Grayson stared at him, amused. "You'll what?" Jalen's voice was calm, steady. "I'll be defending myself." A murmur spread through the courtroom. The bailiff's eyebrows shot up. Carrington's smirk faltered for just a second before he let out a sharp laugh. This should be interesting. But no one was laughing when Jalen took his first step forward. Everything was about to change. Jalen adjusted his stance, hands still in his pockets. He let the silence stretch just long enough to make them uncomfortable. Then finally, he spoke. "Your Honor, before I begin, I'd like to confirm something with the prosecution." Carrington raised an eyebrow, crossing his arms. "Go ahead." "You said Officer Daniel Ruiz personally saw me behind the wheel before I was arrested." "Correct?" Carrington exhaled sharply, already bored. "That's right." "And that testimony is in his report?" "Of course it is." Jalen nodded, then turned to Judge Grayson. "Your Honor, I move to dismiss that testimony as evidence." Grayson squinted. "On what grounds?" Jalen pulled his hands from his pockets and gestured toward the prosecution's table. "Because Officer Ruiz never saw me in that car. In fact, he wasn't even on duty when the chase began." A flicker of confusion crossed Carrington's face. "What are you talking about?" Jalen stepped forward. "If the court allows, I'd like to submit a request to verify Officer Ruiz's GPS logs from that night. If his report says he witnessed me in the vehicle, then it should match his location history. But he let the word hang. I have a feeling it won't." The gallery murmured louder. Grayson frowned, glancing at Carrington. "Counselor?" Carrington hesitated. The pause was just long enough. The jury noticed. The gallery noticed. And most importantly, the judge noticed. Jalen had spent years watching trials, studying prosecutors, their tactics. And there was one thing he knew: if Carrington was confident in his case, he wouldn't be stalling. Grayson sighed, rubbing his temple. "Counselor?" Carrington finally shook his head. "No objections, Your Honor." But the shift had already begun. For the first time, the courtroom wasn't laughing anymore. By the time Jalen finished dismantling the case, exposing unreliable testimony, questioning forensic procedures, and revealing the victim's original statement that the thief was white, Carrington had nothing left. Judge Grayson let out a slow breath. "Does the prosecution have anything further?" Carrington was stiff, face flushed. "No, Your Honor." Grayson looked at Jalen for a long moment. Then at the jury. Finally, he leaned forward and spoke the words that would stay with everyone in that room. "Case dismissed." A beat of stunned silence. Then chaos. As Jalen stepped outside, reporters swarmed the courthouse steps. Cameras flashed. Questions fired. Denise Dawson stood at the bottom of the steps, arms crossed, expression unreadable. Then, finally, she shook her head and let out a breath. "Boy, you scared me half to death." Jalen chuckled. "Had to take a risk, Ma." Across the street, Judge Grayson watched. His posture was different now. Less arrogance. More reflection. Because Jalen had done something most people never could. He made the system look at itself. And for once it blinked first.